we'd just like to thank everybody for coming. Just in terms of our panel discussion on accommodation. And in this case, we're just trying to use this as a conversation among the panelists and myself. And we've kind of moved the stand board. So we're just, so in that sense, it's to create a discussion in terms of traveller accommodation, the challenges within that, but also in terms of looking at some of the solutions. And I am absolutely, I just want to thank the organisers for inviting me to be part of this conversation and preliminary discussion. And I think it's one that's really important and significant in the context of travellers in Ireland. Without any further delay, because we are running behind time, I'm going to start maybe just, introduce people. So we have, starting beside me, we have Padraic McKenna, NUI Galway, and lecturer in housing and housing rights. We also have Rory Hearne, PhD in policy, economics, and on housing policy from NUI Maynooth, and also to say many other things, and also an author. And he will have a book being published in terms of housing. We have Emily Murtagh, the National Accommodation Policy Officer with the Irish Traveller Movement. And beside Emily, we also have Nora Corcoran, Community Development Worker, and a graduate of university, and delighted to have you here as well, Nora. And without further delay, just to introduce myself, I'm Bernard Joyce. I'm a very proud Irish traveller, I just want to say that. Secondly, I'm very lucky to be the director of the Irish Traveller Movement and have been the director for many years, but have probably been involved in the sector for many, many years, and probably too many. But what's really important is that the work that we do and the changes that we try to make is about the outcomes for the community in Ireland. So just to highlight that. So the first question we're going to ask the panel just to look at those challenges, some of those issues, and some of those solutions. So what I'm going to suggest first is that we go to Emily. And Emily, if you could just bring us through what you see as some of the challenges and some of the issues.
Yeah, so as Bernard said, my name is Emily Murtagh. I'm one of the National Accommodation Policy Officers with the Irish Traveller Movement. And I suppose a big part of my role is bringing together representatives from local traveller organisations, some of which are here today, and just taking the insights and experiences and expertise of the local organisations and working together collectively to advocate for the realisation of traveller rights in relation to accommodation. So I suppose, as you all know, we're in the midst of a massive housing crisis in Ireland at the moment, and one that is only getting worse with homelessness levels coming towards record levels. But when you look at the traveller accommodation, there has always been a crisis in Ireland in relation to the delivery of traveller accommodation. And I suppose it can be very much situated as one of the biggest human rights violations within the history of the Irish state, and one that we have been most frequently brought to task at both an international level through bodies like the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Universal Periodic Reviews, and also through the Council of Europe, as we've been hearing over the last few days. I suppose when we look at that crisis, I suppose we'll be hearing later about from Nora about what that looks like on a local level, but I just kind of want to give you a national overview. I suppose at the moment 39% of all travellers are living in overcrowded accommodation, and the Ombudsman for Children did an amazing report last year that really situated that in terms of the experiences of traveller children living in those situations. And a quote from that has really just stuck with me, and one of the girls who lives on that site, she said, "It's like an abandoned place that people forgot about. It's like we're forgotten. We feel like garbage." And that girl lives on a local authority-run halting site in Cork, where that was originally designed for 40 people, and now 140 people live on that site, with the corresponding impact in terms of fire safety, in terms of health risks. And obviously those issues have just been brought into even more sharper focus during COVID-19. And I know Rory will talk later a little bit more about the overrepresentation within homelessness in some local authorities. They're making up as close to 50% of the homeless population, while making up less than 1% of the overall population. And even this week, it was just brought to our attention a family of 7 who were sleeping in a Garda station for 2 nights with no other accommodation offered, and until there was legal representation made by an independent law centre. So that's the scale of the issue. And I suppose in order to understand how this problem has arisen, we need to look back, and I think that's really in keeping with the theme of this conference. And I suppose the first official state policy in relation to travellers was the report of the Commission of Itinerancy, which was published in 1963. And I suppose that task force was set up to look at solving the problem of itinerancy, and looked at encouraging the absorption of the itinerant population, the traveller community, into the overall population. And it just conceptualised as travellers and a nomadic lifestyle as a problem to be solved, and as Martin Collins said earlier, as failed settled people, and not as a culture and distinct ethnic group to be recognised and celebrated. And I suppose since then, there's been different policies in relation to traveller accommodation, and while in language it's moved away from that kind of assimilationist language, in terms of the actual recognition and understanding and facilitation of traveller culture, we haven't seen that progress, and I think that was most recently captured by IREC in the quality reviews. Just that lack of recognition by local authorities of what it means to deliver traveller-specific accommodation. And I suppose in terms of that kind of policy framework, another key moment was the delivery of the enactment of the Traveller Accommodation Act in 1998, which was campaigned for a long time by the traveller activists. And it's quite a progressive piece of legislation, planning for the delivery of traveller accommodation every 5 years, instructing local authorities to do needs assessments and deliver. But since 1998, the problem hasn't been with the policy, but in how that policy has been implemented by local authorities. And just that failure of local authorities to deliver on culturally appropriate traveller-specific accommodation. And I think that's best demonstrated in the fact from 2008 to 2019, €72 million of the traveller accommodation budget went unspent. And that's in the context of all the statistics that we've already referenced. And I suppose another key moment in the development of traveller accommodation policy was the enactment of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act in 2002, also known as the criminal trespass legislation, which effectively criminalised the cultural practice of nomadism with no requirement of alternative accommodation to be offered. And obviously that level of distress that comes from evictions, and that's something that we've been found in breach of Article 16 of the European Social Charter in relation to those procedures. So I suppose that I hope that kind of contextualises our conversation today, and that afterwards we'll be able to go into some of the solutions and the current moments. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that's really helpful, and I think it's really important to give a kind of contextualising the framework and the policy, and what that currently is in terms of the impact. So we're going to keep it, and thanks for keeping that very precise as well. So we're going to keep it to some of the national frameworks, and I'm going to go over to Rory Hearne, so over to you, Rory.
Thanks, Bernard. And just to make clear, it's Rory Hearne. It's not Hearne, so there's no link to any former Taoiseach. I always make that sure. Very clear that it's a very different name and no relation whatsoever. But thanks, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And in terms of, I suppose, the traveller accommodation crisis and housing crisis, as Emily said, in many ways, and it has been a crisis for many, many years since the foundation of the state. And if we look at what has happened, I think that in many ways, travellers have become even more invisible, I think, within the housing crisis, even though for them, the housing crisis has worsened their situations of housing exclusion. And I just want to talk a little bit about homelessness, because it was something that Emily mentioned and something that I've researched and been worked on. And it is shocking to see the disproportionate impact, the disproportionate numbers of travellers who are experiencing homelessness. And the numbers you mentioned there, in Dublin, for example, 9% of all homeless families, in some of the counts that were done, 9% were travellers. Yet, as we know, just less than 1% of the population. In terms of children being homeless, 12% of all children who are homeless are travellers. 25% of all children who are homeless outside of Dublin are travellers, a quarter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, what are the factors that are leading to this, along with the systemic and structural racism and discrimination, but there are policy reasons as well and policy changes that have happened. I was also struck by the figure that women make up 56% of travellers who are homeless, which is much higher than the proportion of women who are homeless overall. It's less than 40%. And also, in terms of, I suppose, what we would call those intersecting kind of inequalities and exclusion, that if we look at the work done by the Cork Traveller Group, who did research, found that a third of homeless family units had a member, a third of traveller homeless family units had a member with a disability. So you're looking at traveller being affected by discrimination, then, as I'll come on to explain, also been recipients of and need of HAP and suffering discrimination, and then disability as well, and how those intersecting inequalities must impact, and to think that they're in situations of homelessness, and as I'll explain a little bit shortly, all the trauma that goes along with that. I tried to do a figure to highlight kind of what would this be in terms of the overall settled Irish population. If the settled Irish population had a similar proportion who are homeless as the traveller population, we would be looking at 125,000 people being homeless across the country. And I think it just shows that disproportionate impact of what is in terms of housing, and Padraic is a much better expert than me in this in terms of human rights and how it looks at homelessness. Homelessness is the most, as the previous rapporteur on housing for the UN said, the most egregious violation of the right to housing, because of its denial of so many other rights that are linked with it. And if we look at homelessness, some of the experiences, again, this was in the report, in terms of the work done by the RTA-GW, the Traveller Accommodation Working Group, the quotes from some of the families who were experiencing homelessness. One talked about they were living in an overcrowded situation with their parents in a bay in a halting site. They had a young baby and 3 other kids. They were on the housing list for 9 years. They were living on the side of the road. They kept getting moved on. They lived in the car for a while. Then they went homeless in hotels. And then they decided to move back to the parents' bay because of the unsuitable conditions. As they said, hotels weren't right for the children. That family are not counted as homeless. They're not in emergency accommodation, therefore they're not counted as homeless. Yet clearly they are homeless, which raises a problem of how we count and measure homelessness. I want to talk a little bit of policy because I'm very conscious at the time that we know that local authorities have failed to build adequate housing for travellers, but one of the big policy changes over the last 15 years has been from councils building social housing to accessing social housing through the market, through the likes of the housing assistance payment, the rent accommodation scheme. They're getting it through the private rental sector. But what this has meant for travellers in particular is that they are subject to even more discrimination and exclusion. The figure from the Residential Tenancies Board said that their research found that 82% of landlords would not rent their property to a traveller. So you have this situation whereby travellers' access to housing in terms of what they're being offered is the housing assistance payment. Yet they can't access private rental accommodation because of the systemic discrimination that they're in. Therefore, this leads to the situation that either they can't find accommodation so they become homeless, or if they are homeless, they can't exit homelessness. They're left there simply because they can't access accommodation because of this discrimination. And we've had figures, Emily and Rosemary were telling me, of one family being in accommodation, emergency hotel, I think it was for 4 years. 4 years in emergency accommodation. And yet we know from research that I've done with homeless families and others that being in emergency accommodation is deeply traumatic for families. It has psychological impacts, it has social impacts, and it is absolutely nowhere appropriate for no longer than weeks for children to be in emergency accommodation. And in terms of that policy, yeah, I think that's probably the main points I kind of wanted to make about that shift in policy, and I'll come on to the solutions as well.
Okay, I think that's really helpful, because I think it's kind of, we're covering some of the policy, the homelessness, some of the I suppose when you drill further into it, you can see some of the challenges within that, and the system, and how it's not recording travellers in terms of homelessness. So the figures are distorted, and we'll probably come back to that. So just moving it on, and we'll hold the questions till later as we go around to everybody. So actually, we'll continue then with this, what you said, Padraic, just if you can.
Sure. Okay, my name is Padraic Kenna. I'm a lecturer here in the university. Can you all hear me? This is my first question at every lecture, because, you know, people are... sharing this panel with experts here like Nora and Emily and Rory, of course, is not an easy thing to do. So I have to try and focus on something that's not being covered. And I'm going to fall back on one of my favourite topics, which is the power of property rights in the Irish state and the Irish constitution. And I know that some of you here have been working on the centenary, looking back at the 100 years. What have we learned from that 100 years? And I'm going to really look at that a little bit more closely, really, in terms of property rights and how the courts balance property rights with the rights of travellers who are being evicted from unauthorised occupation of property. It, of course, highlights the front lines, or the fault lines, if you like, in our human rights and constitutional law. So you'll be aware that property rights in the Irish Constitution have this remarkable, someone would say, sacrosanct position, where the state has not just to recognise them, but to vindicate them. So the state has to actually go out to protect and vindicate. At the same time, we have a body of human rights law, which we have seen emerging from the Council of Europe and other organisations, around the definition of home and the protection of the right to respect for home under the European Convention of Human Rights. And this is a very powerful piece of human rights jurisprudence. It requires a proportionality assessment when somebody is being removed from their home. Home has an autonomous meaning. It's not necessary to be legally defined. It's somewhere where people live. And so we have this body of human rights law which everybody subscribes to. And then we also have this brilliant piece of property constitutional rights. And when these two collide, when these two things come together, we find some interesting developments. And that happened in January this year. In January 22, in the case of Clare County Council and Bernard and Helen McDonough, where this case was decided by the Supreme Court, balancing these two concepts, principles or powers. And the judge, Gerard Hogan, in the Supreme Court at the time, he pointed out that this was a really historic case, 100 years after the foundation of the state, and we're looking at this situation. And he said, of course, that the Irish legal system has not found it altogether easy to accommodate the distinct cultural traditions of the travelling community, such as nomadism and living in large family groups, within its traditional ambit of protecting and enforcing property rights. So you could say he really nailed the issue, really, before the decision. The facts of the case were fairly straightforward. The McDonough family were living in Clare County Council on unauthorised occupation of council land, as they say, without planning permission. They had been evicted previously from a whole lot of different sites under the trespass legislation, and there was now an injunction to evict them once again. They, with the support of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, challenged this injunction process on the basis that it breached their human rights. the right to respect for home under the European Convention of Human Rights. And so this case found its way to the Supreme Court after the High Court and the Court of Appeal. And so this was going to be a sort of historic decision. I think everybody knew that. So what did they decide? Well, the court decided that, yes, the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 8, applies. Travellers' caravans and mobile homes are homes for the protection of the European Convention of Human Rights. But they decided we have even stronger protection in the Constitution under Article 40, which is the inviolability of the dwelling. The dwelling of every citizen in Ireland is, as they say, inviolable. It's a bit of a dated word. And shall not be forcibly entered save in accordance with law. And so they said, well, this requires a procedure and a consideration and something like a proportionality assessment. And so, of course, when we're reading this here, we're getting very enthusiastic that we're going to see dramatic changes in this whole issue. The next question that comes, what do we mean by proportionate? Is it proportionate to evict people, their homes, to the side of the road if they have nowhere else to go? Is it proportionate? I suppose everybody here would say, of course it's not proportionate. You can't really put people on the side of the road if they don't have anywhere to go. And so basically that's what the court said. Well, that is the position. It is, we need some kind of proportionality assessment in all these cases. And this, of course, is not new. We have it already for mortgage possession cases since about 2013. We have it for local authority tenants since 2012. So it's not particularly radical, but it is quite radical to say we need to have a proportionality assessment when we are evicting travellers from what's called unauthorised sites. And so you might say, well, that's been dramatic. What a great success after 100 years. And then, of course, we come back and say, well, then they said we have to consider the particular issues here. How do we balance the property rights? Now, they said, well, there is a difference here because it's a local authority land. It's not quite private property. This local authority already has an obligation to provide adequate accommodation, which they're not doing anyway. So in these circumstances, we find proportionality assessment means no eviction. So it's quite significant. They did say, however, of course, that if this was private land, then the court's first duty would be to vindicate the property rights of the owner. So let's not say that there's been a revolution as such. At the moment, the court's first duty would be to ensure that the property rights of the landowner are adequately vindicated. But different considerations apply where it's a local authority. However, it is a significant development in the integration of human rights into this whole area. It's a major development, I would say, in the protection of home or dwelling and recognizing caravans as dwellings for the purposes of the Irish Constitution, which of course is one element of the right to housing. We need more. We need a constitutional change which puts the right to housing at the same level as property rights. And so what is my concluding message? There has been great development, and a lot of it has come about from organisations like the Irish Traveller Movement, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, taking test cases, raising the human rights issues, presenting them so that other people and other judges can follow them. But let's not forget, though, something 100 years after the state, property rights still trump human rights every time. That's it.
Yep. Okay, I think that's really helpful, and that case itself is significant. But the question about vindicating those rights, you also have to seek legal representation, senior counsel, and you have to assert those rights in terms of the High Court or Supreme Court. So you still have a long way to go, but doing that, I think that's an example in terms of the proportionate assessment in terms of what they're asking is in terms of the assessment or proportionate in terms of an eviction procedure being carried out. And at the end of it, it is, while it's welcomed, is still looking at those steps that are taking place. So many families will still face evictions in terms of being on the side of the road. But I'm just going to move across to Nora, who's been very patient. And I left Nora to last because I think when we're talking about national, it's really, really important as well to get a local kind of context in this. And, so Nora, I'm going to leave it up to yourself and just bring us into the local context.
Thanks, Bernard. So, yeah, my name is Nora Corcoran, and I'm a community development worker with the Galway Traveller Movement, and I'm nervous, just bear with me, but I also lead out on accommodation on our strategic planning. And I know, Padraic, you said experts, but to me, the experts are the people who have to live in these substandard conditions, the people who have that lived experience. Those ones are the experts, and those ones are where the government should really come down and see every single day when children who live in substandard accommodation in halting sites that's beside a waste facility have to go to school in the morning with an empty stomach because the smell of the noxious gases are making them feel physically sick. And one quote really, stood out to me, because we, as well as that, we with the Galway Traveller Movement, we started our Traveller Homes Now campaign back in 2017. So we linked in with the local the travellers in Galway City and County, and then we did our 4 monitoring reports that we published. And one of the quotes was from Angela Delaney, who said, "They think we're rubbish because they leave us beside a dump." And this is just, for me, it just resonates. I feel as I'm sitting here as a member of the traveller community that I have the responsibility of those families who do live in substandard accommodation to have their voices here today, because they're, for the most part, without, the allies, without the traveller organisations, the government is not listening. The local authorities are not listening to those families. We have the roadside families who are children waking up in the morning, who are the condensation is coming down and the clothes are damp. And where are the rights of the child? Why have the United Nations put all these policies and legislation when the local authorities are ignoring the rights of a child? In this day and age, to me, that's just totally unacceptable. There needs to be accountability. It needs to be called out. And then, of course, where are we now? We're 2 years into the middle of a pandemic, because we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We might be wearing, for most masks, but we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We still have families living in overcrowded, substandard accommodation, right in the middle of COVID, when it was at its worst. We had 1,000 members of the traveller community who got COVID. We had 1/3 of the families, the traveller community, in ICU. They didn't have the privilege of isolating. They didn't have the privilege of sanitary, where they could wash their hands with warm water. Not when you have one tap in a Portaloo. So a Portaloo, how in God's name are you supposed to have proper conditions when you don't even have proper running water? So COVID is still going on, and the families, they might have a few Portaloos, there might be a tap here, but for the most, the situation still hasn't changed. What we did, we organised, in collaboration with the HSE, that we organised to keep families isolating as much as we can. We organised a wraparound where we'd go around, we were out there in the front line delivering groceries to keep the families in. So by that, we actually kept the numbers down, and then we obviously supported the families to get vaccinated. And again, it's just kind of going back and saying to them, look, we know your situation is dire, but we want to support you as much as possible, just kind of to keep you alive. So I'm on the local traveller community, the LTACC. Okay, so I'm on that to represent the travellers. I'm on the housing SPC, and what really upsets me is that they still don't have a voice in this. Sometimes I just feel as my role is tokenistic. I'm just ticking a box, to keep the government happy. But I don't always kind of keep the government happy in there, and I always get the eyes up to heaven when Nora's there. But I have that responsibility again to bring the voice of those families to the table. So, it's kind of, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And especially with our Traveller Homes Now campaign, we're constantly keeping it fresh in the government's memory and mind that we're not going away. We are a strong, resilient community, and what we do with our tenor participation groups, we try to empower the community to get, to speak for themselves, to have that voice, and for the most part, they would prefer it if we were just invisible, but that's not going to happen. Not when I'm there. Not when our local travel organisation always linking in with the families. So it's just, for me, seeing the families directly impacted by these conditions in 2022. it says a lot about the country we live in. And that's why we have to be strong. We have to be on the front line constantly advocating, supporting, challenging, calling out. And I'm just, for me, like I worked in hospitality for 20 years and I'm with GTM for the last 4 years, and it's the happiest place I am that I can be there to represent my community. And while we are there, we're not going away. And I know someone said before, between you and the Galway Traveller Movement, my heart broke, but I don't care. That's why we're there. We're going to break their hearts because we're there to represent our community and we're not going away. So, and one thing I just want to say before I finish, and hasn't come from me, I think it was I Live Lynn, but we need the voices of the families need to be brought to the table, because if it's about us, it shouldn't be without us. So I just want to say that. Thank you very much.
Okay. So we're not going to let you away lightly, Nora. But I think, if you're looking at that, I think it's really important that the very community that you're trying to represent are also the community that are at the forefront. And I think community development is really about putting the people who is impacted to the very front of that discussion and at the table and being inclusive and being part of the solution. And for too long in the past, travellers weren't part of those discussions. So I think I commend you, Nora, in terms of being there. It's not an easy place to be at. It's challenging, but also it can be very challenging in not seeing the outcomes, but still giving everything you have in order to bring about that change. And I think that's right across the board as well, to the other panelists as well. So I have one final question, and then after that, when people answer that, we'll put it out to people. So just if you can sum it up, Nora, just in terms of solutions, if you're to pick one or two key changes, just in terms of what you think would actually make a difference. So from earlier on, we heard about policy, and we heard about travellers being researched, but looking going forward now, what would be needed in terms of policy implementation to make that change happen?
Well, I suppose there's loads, but some I can't say here. But anyway, the commitments of the local authorities, they're laid out, but they're just not properly implemented, So we see this in the constant underspend. But if they can't, there is also potential of the likes of Kenna to lead out in a national, scale if local authorities can't deliver, Take it away from the local authorities, give it to someone who will deliver, because it's obviously not working. And for so long, it's like, if there is a saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, it has been broke, and we're trying to fix it, but we can't do it on our own. So that's just.
Okay. So are you saying then that there's a need for a national drive and agency?
Yes.
Accommodation agency?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And it has to be, because if you look a year upon year upon year, we're still seeing the same issues, the substandard conditions, the lack of refurbs, and again, the substandard refurbs, because I link in with families, and this is what's happening. They're telling us, it's substandard. So if you're going to do it, please do it right, Okay.
Nora, thank you so much. No problem. And I'm sure there'll be questions coming,
please go easy.
later. Emily, just in terms of one or two key points on that in terms of solutions.
Yeah, I suppose one thing, the overarching thing is that until there's more delivery of units, until people's lived experience is better on their day-to-day lives is improved, then nothing that happens at a national level matters. But I suppose just to really link it back to some of the things that I think will lead to that, in 2019, the government, there was an independent review of the Traveller Accommodation Act. So that was carried out and published in 2019, and within that are 32 key recommendations for the improvement of the planning and delivery of traveller accommodation. So I suppose the 2 years in, we've seen around 6 or 7 of those implemented so far. So it's really that the scale of response has never matched the scale of the problem, and the speed of delivery has never matched the level of need. So I suppose just to hone in on some of those recommendations that are particularly important, like Nora kind of alluded to, that idea of a national traveller accommodation authority. So a national body that's job is to monitor and implement, so monitor the planning and delivery of traveller accommodation at a national level, because there is no accountability at the moment when local authorities fail to plan, when their TAPs, their traveller accommodation programmes, don't plan for future need, when they aren't setting targets for traveller-specific accommodation in some cases at all. So we need a national body that has sufficient power to intervene in those situations. And I think as well, like, this whole question is such a political one, because at a local level, elected representatives have the power to vote on traveller-specific accommodation through a process called the Part 8 process. And obviously that has been used as a vehicle for systemic, both individual and structural racism, when those elected representatives are lobbied to vote against these developments. So we want to see that Part 8 process just completely bypassed for traveller-specific accommodation. Yeah. Can I say one more?
Yeah.
And I think thirdly, another one of those recommendations, and it's so important in terms of nomadism, is the repeal of the criminal trespass legislation, to completely end that legislation and completely review the eviction procedures as well. So those three. Yeah.
Okay, Emily, thanks for that. I think there are three significant areas there: the Traveller Accommodation Authority, the Part 8 public consultation in terms of planning, and the third was repeal the criminal trespass legislation, which really lies with the Minister Helen McEntee in terms of the review of that legislation, which are really significant in the context of traveller culture, identity, and way of life. So they're really important and significant. So I better get this one right. So it's Rory Hearne. Okay, not related to Bertie Hearne, but Rory. So just in the context then of some key solutions.
Yeah, I think I would agree completely with the proposal and the idea to develop Kenna as a housing association. And I think if we look at policy over the last few years, social housing policy, housing associations, the not-for-profit organisations, have been really given an expanded role in delivering social housing. They're now delivering building a half of all new social housing. But we haven't seen the same expansion by Kenna, and that is down to, as we were talking earlier, the lack of resourcing. So I think there needs to be specific resources allocated to Kenna well, this would be a suggestion, and would be to allocate sufficient resources, funding, to Kenna, that it could develop to be quite a significant housing provider, providing traveller-specific accommodation, and also that it's given the land as well, because that's vital. Housing associations can't build unless they have access to land. So I think that has to be a resource to really, and there's no reason why that couldn't be delivering hundreds of units each year. Housing associations, individual housing associations are delivering up to 300-400 a year. Why can't Kenna as well be supported to do that? And I think it would give the traveller community as well the independence to be developing the housing and developing the skills as well, and the expertise as housing associations do. The other one is in terms of measuring and how we develop housing policy, and I think we need to adopt the ethos framework, which is a way of a broader definition of homelessness and housing exclusion, and measuring homelessness, which includes different types of, for example, hidden homelessness, insecure, unfit habitation. And currently housing policy in Ireland on homelessness doesn't use that. I think we should use that. And finally, I think the right to housing. We need to put the right to housing in the Constitution. I'm part of a broad civil society alliance called Home for Good, and we've developed a proposal for wording to change the Constitution. It's now with the Housing Commission. Hopefully that will be recommended to hold that referendum next year. And I think that is absolutely key in terms of making the state at all levels constitutionally obliged to ensure people have access to adequate housing.
Okay, I think that's excellent. Just to say that we're all engaged in that last one in terms of housing to be a constitutional right, and that is really important in terms of framing it and naming it, but also in terms of the referendum itself. So thanks so much for that. Padraic, you have the final word on the solution.
As I said, I knew it wasn't going to be easy to be on a panel with these experts. There's not much I can add.
I think there is.
I
think there is, yeah.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I agree with those recommendations from the working group, the review. I also agree that we need to put the right to home on the same basis as the right to property in the Constitution. perhaps even at a higher level. And we also need to make sure that all the international agreements that we've signed up to, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and all of the conventions on non-discrimination need to be integrated into our legislation and implemented fully. And I think that'll have a couple of effects. One is that it will orient the institutions of the state to taking these things seriously. But the other thing I think it would do is it will have a symbolic meaning for the country as a whole, to say that we recognize these things after 100 years of the state. We're now mature enough to take these on board and say we're going to apply them.
Thank you for that. And just to say, we're well on track. We're at 5 p.m. now. So we're just going to put it out to people. So you've heard the national context in terms of the House and the framework and the policy, but you've also heard the realities on the ground is that there's good policy, but you've also heard that there's still a significant crisis in terms of provision of accommodation, homelessness, and also in terms of legislation that's still in place, which really, between the criminal trespass legislation, which was introduced, which for the very first time moved travellers from parking on private lands or public lands as a civil matter into a criminal. So that was that just changed the way that the legislation was enforced. So the other side of this is just in terms of you hear some of the suggestions in terms of going forward. But I just want to ask, is there any questions from yourselves in terms of what you've heard, or any clarity that you would like to get? Now that was a hand in the back. There's two. So we'll start with the person in the green. You have the mic.
Yeah, hi.
And just kind of introduce yourself, your name and who you are, just before you start.
Yeah, my name is Kate Miskela and I'm here to represent Forsa Trade Union, but I'm also the Secretary of the Trades Council in Wexford. And where I come from, I'm actually from a county which has a very high traveller population. Yep. And I just want to reiterate what Nora was saying about the SPCs in the local authority, because we actually have a representative on the one in Wexford. But really it's just a talking shop. So anything we say, and I just think something needs to be done with the local authorities. I think you're right to take it away from the local authorities, but it's definitely failed if by the figures, and I know there was a large amount of money in Wexford for the traveller accommodation that wasn't used as well, but the fact that 72 million nationally is not used, something seriously wrong. And if there's anything we can do to help you to support to change that, bring it on.
Absolutely. So I think we'll come back to you on that, and thank you for that. That's more of a statement rather than a question, and that's just kind of showing more, solidarity and alliance. So certainly we'll come back. I seen so there was some. Yeah. Again, just introduce yourself and your name, and then we'll come.
Lisa Connell and Forza Trade Union as well. Just to pick up on the point that you had made, Rory, just around the constitutional right to housing. In order to reflect that into the Constitution, would there need to be work around changing anything within the Constitution on property rights, or what's the payoff between the two?
Okay, we'll hold that. We'll hold that question, right? Okay, and there was over here was it the pink top? Pink, red, red, pink.
Bright and colourful.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Anca Minescu. I'm a psychologist from University of Limerick. And my comment to you all is about how can we take this angle of homelessness that disproportionately affects Irish travellers, but it is a national problem here, and more recently a Ukrainian national problem as well. How can we take that maybe as a point of unifying the Irish nation around the problems of travellers? Because unless you also fight especially that racism at especially that local council level, and especially in those neighborhoods where there's land where a site could go in, I don't think any more legislation will sort the problem. So I suppose for me it's about fighting anti-gypsyism, anti-traveler feeling has to go hand in hand with solving the housing crisis. but maybe in the case of travelers, there's a chance there to also show we are people too, we have these rights too, just as all these other people who are also homeless have it. So
Okay.
two aspects, or maybe just a comment, not a question, never mind.
Yeah. Actually, it is a question. It is a question. So we're going to hold that question as well. And there was a question to the front. So there's two hands. One hand. Yeah, Thomas, we have...
So I work for travel organisation, but in a private capacity today. I'd just like to ask the panel, do you think that much has changed since 1963? Like in one way, I suppose, I'm in the work for a long time, I'm getting angry, and I feel in 1963 they were just being more honest. You know, the language has changed, but the practice, there's been very little change in the practice, you know, kind of, like I think we're being told lies a lot of the time. So when the government or a minister replies to a PQ, you know, it's usually whoever the ministers were in the past, you know, they're referring to the framework for traveller accommodation delivery. There's no such framework, right? The Travel Accommodation Act is known, and I would actually suspect deliberately being set up to be dysfunctional, you know, kind of, where you can always blame between a local official or a local council, and if that doesn't work, you can pass the blame between the local and the national, right? So the Act has been set up to fail from the outset. Since 1989, it has failed, and they know it's failing, yet they're telling Europe, they're telling us in PQs, it's their framework. The Act gives direction, the Minister gives direction under the Act, as the Minister has been given directions to local authorities. There's a number of local authorities, Cork City Council being one of them, who has been ignoring it, all of them this time round, and some of them the last time round. The Minister never gives a gig about it. Whoever the Minister or previous Ministers, the Department never gives a gig about it. So there's law breaking. Cork City Council breaks the law, other local authorities break the law. Now imagine, if I don't pay my TV licence, kind of, the Minister wouldn't take as casual an attitude, but the Minister doesn't care. We have a National Travel Accommodation Consultative Committee that has 3 lines of like terms of reference, kind of like the current chair, the professor. You don't need to be a professor to understand it. You know, the adequacy of travel accommodation programs, he knows they're being ignored. The NTACC never opens its mouth. The NTACC is meant to be there to be useless. Like even if it had a good chair in Chris Flood a number of years ago, it hasn't been any more effective than either. The current chair is now in his 3rd term. He's there to be a goon, you know, to give cover for the department. And I just want to look at the eviction proceedings. The last government was it the Fine Gael Independence Alliance government still, during the first lockdown under COVID-19, they put a moratorium on evictions, and following the intervention of the ITM and other national travel organisations, travellers were included in that. And then we had this partial opening, and then we had the second lockdown, and there was another eviction moratorium. But this time, travellers were taken out of it. So some racist official with some racist minister giving the backing, like consciously decided, you know, well, it was good enough the first time around, but let's take travellers out of it. So it doesn't strike me as if there's been a hell of a lot of change. And if we talk about the public sector duty, just talking about the 200 quid, like I saw a meme yesterday from someone in the Sligo Traveller Support Group, there's 1,000 of travellers that haven't received it. Well, there's 2 sites in Cork that haven't received it. And the Minister knows about it, and the Minister of Housing knows about it, the Junior Minister for Travel Accommodation knows about it, and the Minister, like Minister Ryan, who has the brief for energy, knows about it, you know. Well, did you do an assessment for compliance under the public sector duty? I suspect not, because I don't see how it could have been passed. So I'd like to ask the panel, has there been much of a change other than in the lingo being used by the state?
Yeah. And just before we go, Tom, you've said a lot there. Can I just ask you, what do you think the solution is?
Well, the solution is like an agency, but I can't see it happening.
Okay.
Like a travel accommodation agency. Like as Nora was saying, if local authorities are failing, we need someone to deliver on it. Well, they've been failing for long enough. They've been failing for the last 20 years under the Travel Accommodation Act, and they've been failing since the beginning of the state. So someone needs to step in and not allow them to fail any longer.
Okay.
And they need the power to deliver on it.
Okay, well said. So I think we're all, there seems to be a consensus here, and there's, in terms of the priority in terms of a national traveller accommodation authority, in terms of oversight and overseeing and implementation in terms of travel accommodation. But I'm also going to come back now. So there was a question for you directly, Rory, from the back. Okay?
Yes.
Sorry, and there's questions here as well. Yeah.
There's still more questions.
Sorry? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, yeah.
Sorry,
apologies. I thought you were holding the mic for Thomas.
I was, because I didn't want people
Thomas.
not to hear, because I agree with everything that Thomas said, and we've just had that conversation about the NTACC, and having sat on the NTACC, I can say that it never worked. But one interesting thing that in 2013, and what you've all left out from all of your presentations, is the failure of HAP and the way in which the state has changed the way housing was delivered nationally, but the specific impact on travellers, because of the fact that, and that is why there's such a high number of travellers in homeless accommodation, as travellers cannot access private accommodation, full stop. And we know about the lack of delivery. I'm not going to repeat all that. But one other thing, we have talked about getting rid of the Criminal Trespass Act, but no mention of the need for transient sites. And every local authority, even somebody said to me from a local authority very recently, we're not going to deal with that until we've accommodated everybody. But people won't be accommodated if they don't have places to move to. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. And just say to people, we have an hour, and normally this particular topic can take, as people would know, nearly a whole day as a conference. So we're not going to get through absolutely everything. And you're only going to get, what I would say, a snippet of some of the issues. And I think that's what we're trying to cover. But just to say that the whole area in terms of nomadism is such a significant and important area in terms of travellers and who they are and part of culture and identity. And it's also such a significant part where the wider community just don't grasp or understand or get that. So nomadism is a core component of who we are, but it's not entirely who we are as in everything. But it's an important element in terms of nomadism and how we do that. But you're right, in terms of delivery and accommodation and the need for, I wouldn't say use even transit, but the need for network of accommodation across the Ireland, and because part of this is when people come to Ireland, tourists, they are facilitated, they're supported, they're enabled, and it becomes a really nice way in terms of travelling what's called the Wild Atlantic way. And you bring your caravan, you bring your camper, it's actually even attractive to do it. But when a traveller does it, it's a criminal, and it can be seen as a criminal offence, and therefore it's an impediment in terms of the wider society. So that has to change, that mentality in that way. So I'm just highlighting that, because not everybody understands or grasps that. But anyway, that's my point, Colette, to yourself, to clarify that for everybody. So I'm going to come back, and then we're going to try and wrap up unless there's any further questions. So there was a question just in terms of kind of the, there was a few statements that was made, and Thomas, you made some points there, and you also agreed in terms of the housing agency as a housing authority, which is really important. But I'm just going to come back to the panel and say, look, what you've heard there, was there any response that you want to make back?
I suppose we mightn't have named HAP, Colette, but the conditions are there. It's all a collective, regardless of HAP or social housing, traveller-specific trailers, roadside, all the conditions are the same. As Bernard said, you can't name everything, but the result is the same. They're all substandard conditions, and they all have to be challenged, and there has to be accountability for everything, regardless of what title they're under.
Yeah. I'm actually going to give everybody an opportunity, so just take your time, and don't rush, Mike, because I don't think as far as I know, I haven't looked at this, there's no other big commitments after this. But anyway, so we'll, and we ran a bit late. So just take your time, and Emily, just from what you heard.
Yeah, Yeah, a few responses firstly to the person from Forsa. The person who sits on the Wexford SPC from the trade union, before every meeting he emails me if there's anything on the agenda around traveller accommodation. And that is solidarity, and that is being a true ally and reflecting on your own role when you don't have a role that's specifically around traveller accommodation, but when you're in a position of power where decisions are being made, how can you make sure that the voices of travellers are being included, that you are raising those questions? And I think a lot of us in that room have that power, and to be sharing that power and to be informing ourselves on the issues is such a key part. So I'd like to say thank you for that. And there's other, and also you mentioned about those alliances in terms of that kind of anti-racist approach. And I think that's something we do try to do through being part of networks like INAR and being parts of also housing coalitions like Raise the Roof, like the National Housing and Homelessness Coalition, to create those links in people's minds of what racism is in Ireland, who it is affecting, and how we can all work together to end that, because so much of it is around changing people's perceptions and their hearts and their deep-rooted hatred and racism towards groups. So and I think that also links into what Thomas was saying around have things changed since 1963, and I think things change when people's mindsets change, when people aren't being elected onto councils who will go on radio stations and just try and belittle the traveller community and as a way of gaining votes. So unless we all stand against that mindset, that perpetuates. They're just, and totally agree on the transient sites. And in 1995, the task force recommended there be 1,000 units of transient accommodation built. About 50 of those were ever delivered. They're all used for emergency accommodation, those kind of things. So that has never been implemented. So I totally agree with Colette on that as well.
And Rory?
I suppose just in terms of the HAP one, I thought I'd mentioned that in terms of when I was talking. I thought I went into quite detail, so obviously I didn't communicate it very well in terms of HAP, because I was pointing out that it was because of that shift in policy that families, travellers were experiencing that disproportionate level of homelessness. I was trying to make that direct link. And also the issue with HAP, of course, as well, is that when you're in receipt of HAP, you're no longer considered in housing need, and you're taken off the social housing lists. And of course, for travellers in particular, they're even more precarious if they're on HAP, because if they lose their accommodation, they're even less likely to be able to find more another private rental accommodation, and therefore more likely to go into homelessness. So it's even more problematic that they define HAP as social housing. The other issue, question on the Constitution, the proposal from Home for Good that we have made is that the insertion of a right to adequate housing would be put in as a subsection of 48A, which is where private property rights are stipulated. So it is a very clear counterbalancing, counterweight to private property. So when it's a very clear standalone right to adequate housing that the state would have to take on and implement in all policy and practice. But also then in terms of justiciability, judges would have to look at both the right to housing and the right to private property and having equal weight. And the other issue then, that question about homelessness, I wanted to respond. I think it's an interesting point about travellers' experience of homelessness and in particular children as well. And I was struck by looking at the pictures in the exhibition, and I was visiting St. Margaret's Halton site in Dublin there a while ago, and I did one of my podcasts with some of the community from there. And I was really struck again by how children, the universal experience of childhood, everyone can relate to it. And it's something about how do we humanize our common humanity, and how do we express it in ways that, everyone can stop seeing, travellers, migrants and settled, and see us all as what we are, which is a common humanity. And I think children really bring that out in a way that's, is so powerful. And I think there is something about that experience of traveller children who are homeless to bring that forward, that people might connect with it more. So there is, I think, something that's an interesting reflection, something that could be developed more. And the question, the last one, in terms of Thomas about change, I don't know in terms of, I haven't been around that long, but it's... there's something only reflecting a bit. is that the community development work that has been done over the last 30 years in terms of Irish Traveller Movement, Pavy Point, that voice is there maybe more than existed there. So it's not that the state has changed, but there is a change in terms of, having voice, in terms of being organised. And also I think, there's more solidarity, I would think, amongst wider society as well, the settled community. But obviously there's also more expressed racism as well, which is a problem. So I think there's real potential and hope in that, I suppose, growing allyship along with community development, that can force the state to bring change.
Thanks for that, Rory. That's really helpful because I think it's really important. Padraic?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any more I can say, but I mean, we'll have to say something. I suppose at the end of the day, I suppose we're talking about resources, really, and we're talking about access to resources, whether that's accommodation, housing, education, access to the labour market, access to all of the positions in society. It's about access to resources, which is really a common question that travellers face with other groups in society. And so I'd say there are common bonds here that we can develop, which I think are being developed, actually. And that's why I think the way forward is to see the whole question of traveller accommodation in that wider context of a denial of resources in a state that has absolutely ample resources. And that's really the thing, I think, after 100 years, to say we do have a state with ample resources. Yeah. Why are we not allocating them fairly?
Yep. And Bernie, can I just say one
thing? Yeah.
We are in the middle of a crisis within our community, a mental and physical health crisis. We have a suicide rate that's 7 times higher than the general population, and it's all down to inadequate accommodation. Under all the social terms, it all linked in. So, and again, you go back to the 1963, that forced assimilation, that oppression. We're still being, those policies are still being implemented in a different kind of way. So, truthfully, the community really needs to have apology from the state for causing this mental and physical health crisis through all this systemic discrimination, and it's just like we have a high mortality rate with our children, our women, our men, everything. And it's all down to the fact of this oppression and forced assimilation. Yeah. So again, we're being seen as a problem, but we didn't create the problem. It was the government who created the problem, and they need to stand accountable for that. Yeah.
So we're actually coming to a conclusion, and I won't wrap up, but I did see one. I'm going to allow one more question, and it was from Gus O'Connor. And did I get that right? Yep. Okay. So what's your question? The mic is just coming down. So just introduce yourself and.
Gus O'Connell. This on? You can hear me, no?
Yep, we can hear you well. Yeah.
Gus O'Connell. I'm a counsellor in South Dublin, and I've been involved with travellers, I suppose, for the last 65, 70 years. And I'm currently the chairperson of the LTACC. And I'm delighted to be here for these couple of days, and I compliment you on really getting down to the bottom, because it is a question of human rights. That's where it starts. And then accommodation is the other side of that same coin. And just to share with you, if you like, the frustration and just looking at just a few points. First of all, the process that's there for approving housing or accommodation for travellers is skewed. And it means that it's so complicated that unless you have a manager or a CEO that is prepared to make it work, there are so many problems in it, it takes years. We have one site in our area, for example, and some people here know it, and for the last 14 years, it's on the TAP programme. Hasn't been done yet. It's crazy. A local authority has to put forward their plans. They'll be scrutinised at national level. They'll be sent back down. Eventually, you might get funding. The second thing I would say is there isn't enough consultation and enough involvement of traveller families and traveller development groups. They're peripheral. They have an advisory role, a consultative role, but they don't have a decisive role. And that needs to happen, whether it's done nationally or locally, unless we involve people themselves. And way back in the 80s, when I worked in the Youth Employment Agency, we had a very good project going that time with travellers in Dublin inner city, and it worked extremely well. but it does need to be done. If we want to get culturally proper accommodation for travellers, we will have to involve traveller families much more. Thirdly, transition sites, been raised already. It's a contradiction in terms. We stop travellers from using any place on this little island unless we put them in there. That is not nomadism. We need to have hot sites that will allow travellers to practice. Not everybody wants to do it, but those who do want to do it. The fourth point I would make relates to this. If I happen to be a settled member of Dublin and I'm homeless or I'm in need of social housing, I'll get a house and I will pay rent. If I'm a traveller or a traveller family and I choose to live in a traditional traveller way, I will get a site and I will have to put my home on that site and I'll pay a rent on it. That is totally wrong. Some travellers can afford their own homes. Some, we have a loan scheme now in its infancy. It's very inadequate, but it's beginning. That may help some people on what I would call the affordable side, but an awful lot of travellers in my county who are living in inadequate sites and inadequate accommodation, they deserve to have a home that they can rent. Why not? At the moment, it will cost us to provide a brick and mortar house a minimum of 230,000. You will get a good mobile for that is meant to fit people on this island in all kinds of weather for around 120,000. And okay, both have a lifespan. So don't tell me that it's not economically viable. It is if we had the wherewithal to do it, and it needs to be done. And finally then, what I would say to you is this. There is an unwritten policy, which is to force members of the traveller community into fixed housing or settled accommodation. And I think all of this comes back basically to human rights. I don't know whether the accommodation should be delivered from a national perspective or from a local one. But I think unless we get the mindset changed, and I think what you're doing here is going a long way towards that. It needs to happen. We need to recognize that travellers, and at the moment, if I look back, in '91 when I came into the county council first, there was a very strong local apathy, and then it manifested itself in real racism. And they wanted to stop travellers from being here and being there. Now there is much more of an acceptance. And a lot of the politicians like myself, some of them are very understanding. I won't say sympathetic, but they're very understanding. We need to build on that, whether it's local or national. So I commend you on what you're doing here. It's the way to go. But unless we accept that we must house travellers in as good accommodation as everybody else requests, then we're going to go nowhere. It's a basic human right, has to be tackled. Míle mágad.
And I think myself and Gus go back a long way in terms of the local travel accommodation consultant committee, and I have to commend Gus and many others who, and they're not in the majority, they're in the minority in terms of local elected representatives who are really pushing for changes to take place. But just in terms of I'll wrap it up, and I just want to really thank the panel because I too feel that the engagement discussion, there's a lot of knowledge inside, and yes, part of this is that we cannot do this by ourselves. So I know Rory is a great supporter and ally, not only to travellers, but to a lot of other groups as well. And I know in terms of the work of Galway, which is significant and, and enabling and empowering. And I think it's really important that whatever we do, we just can't do it by ourselves. So the onus and responsibility should not entirely be with the traveller community. It should not be about that the community must be enabled, must be supported and be at the table. The reality is, there's a systematic system in place that is institutionalized and is embedded within racism, and is and is not addressing the inadequacy of, children and women who are living in some of the worst substandard accommodation, in Ireland. And that is a reality. But the other side of that is not everybody understands or gets that. Until we get to a stage where somebody says it's absolutely not acceptable, regardless who you are, that any child on this island do not have water, sanitation, or electricity. Until we get to that stage and stop putting the onus on travellers and me and other people, Nora and other people, we have to get to that stage. And the other side then is that in terms of there is change, and part of that is we're working towards that. And I sit in the programme board and expert report in terms of travel accommodation, and we report back to the Minister. But there is change. But part of that, if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But we have to show, but that has to continue in terms of the work of ITM, the work of Galway Traveller Movement, the work of Rory in terms of, in terms of policy and change, and part of the Raise the Roof, and the work of allies who are here, like yourself, Padraic, and people who are in the room as well. So we need to bring that about in order that those steps can take place. But in doing that, that's a partnership. That's a civil society, that's groups, that's politicians, that's ministerial, and that's everybody trying to, address the significant concerns that are currently there. Because it is a fundamental impeachment of people's basic fundamental right to have adequate, culturally appropriate, safe provision accommodation on this island, and it's just not acceptable. But the idea of this preliminary discussion was just to touch on it. So it's a snippet, and it just shows. And I want to thank people for holding on, because we've ran over time. We're at 5:30, and we could have gone longer. So again, thank you so much, and thank you.